Welcome to the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange's student webinar series, the Spring 2025 edition. My name is Eric Evanson. I'm the Science Communications Specialist with NAFC. Now, the goal of the student webinar series is to connect students with the fire and forestry community and establish productive working relationships, as well as exchanging knowledge. And speaking of exchanging knowledge, I just want to point out that NAFC is part of the Joint Fire Science Program's Fire Science Exchange Network. There's actually 15 exchanges all across the country. You can see there on the map, all doing a wide variety of fire science information. And if you want to learn more about what they do or what the Joint Fire Science Program does, I encourage you to visit firescience.gov. Now, today's talk is entitled Constructing Fire Frequency and Chronology for Pitch Pine and Table Mountain Pine in Rocky Gap State Park. And our presenter today is Samantha Guercio from Arcadia University. So the way our series goes is we'll go ahead and let Samantha give her presentation, and at the end we'll follow up with a question and answer session. And then during her talk, if you do come up with a question, feel free to pop it into the chat. And then again, we'll revisit it at the very end. We'll wrap up the session with just a reminder related to next week's student webinar series presentation, which will be the end of our series for this spring, and also ways that you can get involved. And lastly, before we start, I'd love to have you just kind of go into the chat and pop in your name and your affiliation, and we can kind of see who's with us today. All right, Kevin, Lauren, thank you, gentlemen, for joining today. And Katie, thank you, welcome, all the way from California. And Shlomaya, welcome. So wide range of people attending today, and they're all very excited to hear Samantha talk. And so we're just going to go ahead and we'll begin. I'm going to stop sharing and we're going to hand it over to Samantha, and she can tell a little bit about herself and then go ahead and start her presentation.
Hello, everyone. Let me just give me a moment so I can share my presentation to you. Okay. So, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to be talking about my research with the pitch pine and table mountain pine from Rocky Gap State Park. And before we start, I did want to talk a little bit about myself. I'm graduating in a few weeks with my Bachelor's of Arts in Biology. And I take a lot of classes focused on the natural sciences of conservation, ecology. I really enjoy this research that I'm doing, which is why I've worked with Dr. Lauren Howard. My hometown is in Buffalo, New York, Western New York area, if you're familiar with Lake Ontario. And I've been working with Dr. Lauren Howard since May of 2024, which is about a year. I haven't been working with him very long, but I'm learning every day. I'm getting my feet wet all the time. And when I graduate, I'm hoping to move to my hometown in Buffalo, New York, and continue my studies. I'm currently looking for positions, but I'm also interested in environmental law, where I'm going to be doing a little bit of research on that. But that's where I'm looking at right now. So a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. I wanted to introduce what dendrochronology is and what Rocky Gap State Park is in their historical aspects and also the composition of the forest. I wanted to talk about my methods and my results and also some limitations of the study and some future directions from here. But if we wanted to look at this wonderful picture of Rocky Gap and one of the trails. So what is dendrochronology? It's a bit of a mouthful of a word, but I wanted to break it down a little bit. Dendro meaning tree, chrono meaning time, and logy being the study of. And so that's exactly what we're doing. We're studying these tree rings and dating them and using those for multiple implementations, which for here, we're doing fire history reconstruction, which we're understanding the frequency and intensity of fires. And we can also look at droughts and temperature fluctuations and changes in the weather. But also with dendrochronology, you can look at things that aren't even trees anymore, like violins and furniture. You can date those, and you can find a lot of historical markers from that. So some of the technique with dendrochronology is you want to cut a cross section of a sample. There are other ways, but for today's reasons, we're just cutting a cross sample. And so this tree sample right here is, you can tell it's pretty raw and it has a lot of chainsaw marks. And so once it's beautifully sanded down, as we can see right here, there's the early wood, which is the light marking here, and this is the early season of the tree, the early growing season, which is around March and April. And here's the late wood, which is the later growing season. And here the line is going to be a little bit darker, and thinner because it's basically protecting itself for the winter season coming. But together, these make 1 year, and we're able to mark those and date each year. So some markers that we're looking at as we're also dating the trees is some fire scars, as we can see in these arrows here. And we're also looking at injuries and micro rings, anything that can tell us more about history. But some other reasons that we would want to create accuracy is multiple samples from one tree. For multiple reasons, if a tree is on a slant, then some areas might not have all of the rings, or a fire scar might not be visible in every sample. So to create accuracy, we might want to cut multiple samples out of a tree. As we can see this line here, this year is not existing at this part of the sample, but more towards the top of the sample, it creates some existence and we're able to see it visually. So let's take a look of that with my microscope. So I'm going to switch over and I'm going to move the camera just a little bit here. So I wanted to show what we're looking at when we're labeling a fire scar. And this is a beautiful one right here. We could see that this side is more towards the center of the tree and it's growing out this way. And this is the fire scar here. So before the fire happened, there's a lot of normal growth. The tree rings are looking relatively parallel to each other. And once we have this fire scar here, we can trace it down and we can label the year, but we can see this warping here. And that's a huge identifier for a fire scar because what happens is that the cambium dies right here, and the living cambium needs to kind of protect it and wrap around itself like a band-aid and sort of cover that dead vulnerability. And so there's a lot of this warping here, and then if we want to look, well, where are we? There we are. So there's actually, let me see if I can get all three, but there's three fire scars here, so they can look kind of differently. The first scar that I showed you is a perfect fire scar for a first example, but we have three different scars that don't look the same. So we have this one here, which is not as clear if you're unfamiliar with looking at fire scars, but it has a little bit of resin around it, and it's this darkened area, and we can tell that that's a fire scar with this warping around it as well. And then over here we have two fire scars. So we can see there's a little bit of a micro ring right there. And then there's some resin ducts, and we would track the scar to right there. And then there's also one right here, which we can see a lot of resin ducts, and which are these little red spots that you see. And there's that. And so I also did want to show, I have two samples from the same tree, and one of them has a fire scar and the other doesn't. So this really helps with being able to identify fire scars that are only in certain areas. So we have actually two fire scars here. So we have one here and we have another here. And we can see a little bit of like warping, and we can see a little bit of resin ducts, and there's a little bug hole. And then if we look at the other sample that's taken lower from the tree, in the same spot, we don't have that fire scar. Even if we trace down a little bit, there's a little bit of a suppression in tiny little rings here, but we can't really say that there's a fire scar there. We would only label it as a possible fire scar because the other sample has one. But if we only had the sample, we wouldn't be able to say that it has a fire scar. Okay, so now I'm going to move back over to the presentation. Okay. So a lot of the causes from fires are from people. Human intervention is a big causation for fires, and we're gonna go through the history of Rocky Gap and how that might have been caused through time. So Rocky Gap is encompassed by Allegheny County, and the closest town to that is Cumberland. So I did a lot of my historical research through Allegheny County and Cumberland because those were the most enriched in historical information. Cumberland is about 7 miles from Rocky Gap, so it's entirely um, okay to be kind of grouping it up here. But first, the Allegheny County was occupied by the Shawnee tribe until the 1750s. But before that, there was journal documentation and eyewitness documentation that indigenous peoples were using burning for cultural reasons, for transportation, for um, for cattle, and for plants. And there's a lot of historical information that we have in other sites. I wasn't able to, with my archival research, find specific information on the Shawnee tribe, but in the nearby area of indigenous land, there is eyewitness documentation of the burning. And from the 1954 to 1765 was the French and Indian War, where the settlers began occupying Cumberland, where also George Washington was another significant person who was a part of this settlement. And these people were driving the Shawnee tribe out, and that left a lot of the forest to be untouched for a while, as they were mainly staying in the settlement in Cumberland. And so we'll look at that in my results, that we can see that a lot of the forestry from my samples were not being touched from fire. And so then we have the construction of the US 40, which is the first national road in 1811. We have the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal from 1828, and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, 1828 as well. And so these were major changes in the fire regime, the local forest. These were human interventions that were major, that were happening at nearly the same time. And of course, humans didn't have any care of what was happening to the forest, and how these were increasing the vulnerability for the nearby area. But if we wanted to look at these pictures, we can see this is the railroad from the B&O. And immediately you can see some fragmentation. And so this used to be completely untouched closed forests, and there's a big cut in it now, which leads to a lot of vulnerabilities for sparks to ignite the nearby grassland, for someone to throw a cigarette out the window. There's a lot of chances and variability for things to happen. And there's also the canal here that is a very old photo, so it's a little bit blurry, but we can see the basic outline of the canal and the mountains in the nearby area, which we saw in an earlier picture. And these human interventions have a big make a big change for the forest, and if it's too fast and too big, it's hard for the forest to accommodate. And another thing I did want to focus on is that there was coal mining and logging. Logging could have also been a big issue for the forest composition, because they were picking through the forest, finding specific trees for their needs. So, they weren't actually looking at a pine or oak, because that wasn't something that they were looking to cut. I found a really interesting journal of the numerical data of what trees they were cutting down, and pine was very low on the scale. But what that tells us is that there's a decrease in competition for pine as they're picking through these forests for logging. That leads a lot of more open canopy coverage, but that exposes the ground floor to more sun that can dry out areas that aren't used to be that dry, and it can lead to more vulnerability for ignition. The purchase of Rocky Gap State Park was in 1963. And this is another picture here. This looks like it's from the 70s. 74 is when Rocky Gap was established as a park open to the public. And prescribed fires are very new, actually, which the first prescribed fire in Rocky Gap happened in 2020. Prescribed fires are really beneficial for areas like this because they are fire tolerant and resistant. So what happens is that the low intensity fires really help the maintenance because it'll burn off any fuel from the ground, like um, any trees that have fallen and dried out, any leaves, any sort of dried vegetation that could build up. And it also increases the tolerance for pine trees and oak because these small intensity fires allows it to heal and build up over time. And so with these prescribed fires, they help aid in that regeneration and maintenance. So in Rocky Gap, we have a lot of vegetation here. And we have some pine trees, which actually in this picture, it looks like I can't tell if it's pitch pine, but it's definitely a pine tree back there. We have a little oak tree right here. And this is, there's an abundance of Mount Laurel, which we can see in the foreground and the background. There's also reported to be blueberries, huckleberries, eastern hemlock, Virginia pine. And so this building here is a resort on Lake Habib. And if we look at this photo, we can see that resort in a topographic setting. But this is where all of the trees were sampled for my research. And this area is very mountainous. It's close coverage. There's not a lot of people trekking through here every day. And it's very protected because there's a lot of vegetation that is mainly untouched. But if we start with my methods, once we have these samples, I received these samples from Dr. Lauren Howard, and I sanded them starting at a 50 grit on this table sander here. And I would use a hand sander for bigger samples like this one, because if I were to put this big sample onto this small belt, I'd likely get an uneven surface. So for smaller samples, I use the table sander, and I went all the way to 400 grit, which is more fine than you would get for your tables and your furniture, because we want to see every detail, we want to see every cell, and we want to be able to look at the fine details under a microscope. And so once everything is beautifully sanded down like this picture, I had scanned them with an Epson scanner at 2400 DPI, and I put them into Crew Recorder, where I was able to uh, select each year and mark them down. And so what's really interesting about these is that they're very unique. And so each year is basically like a barcode, where once I put it into CDendro, which is more of the analysis, after I have recorded all the years, it compares it to another chronology, which has all of the years done in a statistical manner. So then it compares that chronology with the tree that I have here, and it would look at them in statistical significance. And so I'm able to date it that way. The chronology that I used was from Sidling Hill, which is 23 miles away east, and they have similar conditions, so it actually compared very well. And so once I put it into CDendro, I go through phase, which just organizes all the trees for me. I'm able to analyze a little bit more qualitatively, and which we can see that right here. So there's a few things that I wanted to point out before I dive really deep in. But this, I had 17 trees, which are all labeled here, and it's all in chronological order. And I have this bar right here is labeling extensive fires, which I have identified extensive fires as two trees or more have had this scar. And if we look here, there's 1706 and 1715, which is pre-colonization for this area, there is two extensive fires. But I would like to add that there are only 3 trees that I was able to date for this far back. But the total chronology is actually from 1682 to 2018. And we have this huge gap here, which is if we remember what I was talking about earlier about the French and Indian War, that there was a lot of area that became untouched once the Shawnee tribe was driven out. And then we have this huge burst right here, if anyone hadn't noticed already, from 1900 to about, if we want to include this one, 1962, there's this huge rush of fire, and especially in 1931, that's a lot of trees that are getting burnt often as well. And so what we're looking at is this is possibly because of the fire suppression era, which was occurring in this time where people thought that fire was bad and that it was very damaging, and didn't consider that these fire tolerant species needed it for maintenance. And so it actually, with the human intervention of industrialization plus suppression, that this leads to very frequent fires. I did also want to mention that during this time, Rocky Gap has gone through 4 owners from 1900 to 1962. And one of the primary owners was a dairy farmer, and I don't have any more information besides that, no matter how much I searched. But I would like to think that if this dairy farmer was using what is like spot burning for possibly their cows to feed. So what I mean by that is if they're grazing in a spot, and then they have different spots that they're rotating in. For a post graze spot, they would burn this area to increase and promote the regeneration and rotate through. That's very possible, but that's only a hypothesis. I didn't want to mention it because it's very relevant to this time period. And as we see, once this land was purchased as protected land for Rocky Gap State Park in 1963, there's no extensive fires. So that's also very notable. I did also do a PDSI analysis, and it's not what I expected, but let me break down a little bit of what we're looking at. So a PDSI analysis is looking at the amount of wetness and dryness of the area, and so I used PDSI data from Sideling Hill because I didn't have any PDSI data from Rocky Gap, but they have very similar climate conditions, so it's still relatively accurate. But what it does is it runs through the fire years and how dry or wet that they were the years prior and the years after. And so this line here, this bar, and this line here would label that something is significantly wet in the positives or significantly dry in the negatives. And this is our fire year, the little fire emoji, and we have not very dry conditions years before a fire occurrence, and but we have really wet conditions 4 years before a fire, which is very strange. And so I can only hypothesize of what's going on here is that pine trees do hang on to their needles for approximately 3 years. So if we're putting that into consideration, if we had a really wet year, that's possible for a lot of growth. And so if there's a boom of these growth of needles and they're holding on and they drop and there's a lot of extra fuel, that can leave a lot of also vulnerability for this ignition because there's a higher amount of pine needles, excuse me, on the ground that are dried out. So I did want to talk about a couple of the limitations of my study. So there was a lack of access to my historical archives. There, either because of paywall or because it was really difficult to find any sort of articles that were catering to what I was looking for. There's also the ownership archives, as I talk about with the dairy farm. I was really interested in it, but I couldn't find even the years specifically that this dairy farmer was owning the land, and that would have been really interesting to be able to research more. I also would have loved a larger sample size, especially for older trees, because pre-colonization, those fire years I would love to be backed up with more trees to create some accuracy. Also the PDSI data, although 23 miles, I would love to get some more local PDSI data to confirm my suspicions about the pine needles creating more fuel as there's a bigger growth period 4 years prior. And there's also no past chronology for Rocky Gap. There has to be a first for everything. So this is definitely a working project. So I don't have anything to compare it to, which also makes research a little bit harder. But there's also I didn't have any coordinate data for tree sample distribution. So what I mean by that is if I had gotten a sample from one tree and then 100 meters away was the next sample, to be able to tell how extensive, if they have the same fire scar, to tell how extensive this fire was and spread out. I don't have that information, so that would also be something in the future that I would look into. Some more future directions would be to increase education efforts, especially for prescribed fires. This was an article from the New York Times when the first prescribed fire of Rocky Gap was occurring. They were giving all of the right information about who's doing it, when they're doing it, and why they're doing it, which I think is really important for the public to know, and to help decrease this idea that fire is always bad in every climate and situation. I did also want to acknowledge Dr. Lauren Howard, who's my mentor and helped me through this whole process. Gabriel Cahalan with the Nature Conservancy, who sampled these trees for me to be able to research, and the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. Also Sarah Milburn, who was the park manager at the time during sampling these trees. And at this point, I would be happy to give any answers to questions that anyone might have.
All right, well, thank you very much, Samantha. I'll actually kick it off with just a couple of quick questions. The samples that you showed under the microscope, what what kind of tree was that? Was that pitch pine or?
Yeah, so all of my samples were from pitch pine. The specific species I can't really determine from not being there on the site when being sampled, but they're all pitch pine, so they should have a lot of resin, as with those fire scars had shown.
Okay. And then you said for your study you had 17 trees. Is that those were all pitch pine or was there anything else in with those?
So there might have been some different species that were similar, but they're all pitch pine.
Okay, great. That's yeah, thank you for clarifying that. And then interesting with the prescribed burn. I think on one of your slides, was that in 2020 was the first prescribed burn?
Yes,
Okay. All right. Um, excellent.
for
All right.
Rocky Gap, that is.
Oh, Rocky, yeah, that's right.
Yes.
Okay. All right, we've got a question in the chat here, and if anyone's got any questions for Samantha, please pop them in the chat and we'll go through them. But first one comes from Shlomaya. What were they logging for when you were talking about like the railway, and why no interest in pine and oak?
Yeah, so a lot of the logging was mainly for furniture or for firewood, and so the reason in the journal didn't say specifically why they weren't looking for pine, but I guess that wasn't the wood of preference for their specific interests in their furniture, which I'm not sure why they wouldn't be interested in pine for furniture, but they were on the very low scale for pine for yeah, pine.
Gotcha. All right. Hope that answered the question, Shlomaya, for you. Lauren mentions the living trees were pitch pine. The dead ones were probably pitch pine, but could have been Table Mountain pine. Hard to know without bark and needles. And then it looks like Andrew said it might have been targeting chestnut. So,
Okay.
all right. And then Shlomaya said, thank you for the response. And Katie earlier had made reference, she loved the microscope view
Oh,
of the
good. I'm glad.
samples.
I
So
hope it was clear.
yeah. And then let's see here. John says, I'm not familiar with dendrochronology methods standards, and I'm wondering if you could share more about how do you determine how many cookies from a tree to study? And then is there a standard uh, for height of cookie or DBH? And then how does the different growth on different sides of a tree affect the chronology record?
Mhm. So for the height, it really doesn't matter because you're really only sanding the surface. So like for this example, I'm not seeing any of this, I'm only seeing this. It really would just be on preference for width, because the surface isn't going to change with what I'm going to see. What was the other?
There was how do you determine how many cookies from a tree to study?
Oh, so with my samples, I had either even just one sample from a tree is okay, but I had the majority of my samples were there were 2 or 3 samples per tree, and I think that creates enough consistency. Obviously, for any sort of accuracy, the more the better. Um,
Excellent. And then the third part was, how does the different growth on different sides of a tree affect the chronology record? Couldn't one side show wider rings versus an opposite side?
So, if they're leaning in a certain way, you could also, um, because I do have a couple samples where one side they have the same amount of rings, but maybe the width is different on one side than the other. So I also like in the sample it's very asymmetrical. So when I'm counting with endocrinology, I want to go from the farthest point outward because obviously it's not perfectly shaped, but this is going to give me the oldest year, and I'd move in from here. But if there was a suppression here and I really wasn't able to see these rings very well, I would probably do another set here just to maintain accuracy, to make sure I wasn't missing anything.
Mhm. Excellent. And John, I hope that answers your questions. Are there any other questions for Samantha? And John says yes, thank you.
Okay, good.
Okay, and Dr. Lauren Howard, it's interesting that fire scars are usually on the uphill side of a tree.
Mhm. Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate the questions.
And then Andrew's got one. Wonderful talk, Samantha. Thank you. Do you plan to look at growth ring to examine the relationship of growth to fire?
So I think that there is a relationship, and it would really be interesting to look at that and analyze it. So that, yeah, definitely. I think that there's I mean, even with the sample that we looked at earlier, there is a burst of growth that you can see that the rings are a lot wider. Like if I don't know if you can see the rings are a lot wider here post fire than it is beforehand, and I think that mainly it's because it's trying to protect that area that it's received that fire as much as possible.
Excellent. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Kevin says, great job, Samantha. Okay. All right, last call for questions. Then I've got a couple announcements I'd like to make. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Are you able to see my screen? Okay. All right. So just wanted to mention we've got one more talk in our spring 2025 student webinar series, and that is unraveling the role of plant soil fire feedbacks in driving forest massification and climate resilience from Eva Legg at Syracuse University. And that'll be next Thursday. And I've got the QR code there. If you want more details or to register for it, you can hit the QR code. And it'll take you right to our student webinar series page. Or you can go to firesciencenorthatlantic.org would be another way to reach that page. And then if there's anyone out there that might be interested in wanting to participate or give a presentation for our student webinar series, we're going to have our next one is going to be coming up in the fall of 2025 and would love to have you join. So you can always reach out to me, Eric Evanson, at navchelp@gmail.com. And then Polly, my counterpart at NAVC, is also putting in some links in there related to the the student webinar series. And then also wanted to mention one other thing is that when you were talking about the prescribed burn in 2020, that got me thinking if anyone wants to learn more about prescribed burning, there's a Northeast Midwest workshop that's coming up in July that will be taking place. There'll actually be field trips and online learning from that. It's a blended learning excursion, and Polly's going to put that into the chat as well. Or again, you can just simply go to firesciencenorthatlantic.org and get that information on the workshop. So other than that, I'm not seeing any other last minute questions. Again, John liked the live microscope demo. Yeah, I think everybody really appreciated that. I'm glad that that worked out very well. So otherwise, thank you, Samantha, for your informative talk today. We really appreciate it, and is greatly appreciated that all of you attended to hear what Samantha had to say. And we're going to go ahead and keep the meeting open for another minute or two in case there's any sort of last minute questions. But otherwise, again, thank you everybody for joining today. We hope to see you next week and also have a great day.